Hello and welcome to today's video, where I will be discussing why New Zealand should vote no to the 2019 End of Life Choice Act, which will legalise euthanasia and assisted suicide here in New Zealand. I will unveil what societal effects lie beyond the common understanding that euthanasia is a response of compassion by alleviating severe suffering. Currently, as we speak, the polling booths are now open, but I thought I would get this video out before voting closes on October 17th, because until voting actually closes, it's not too late to have a say in voting no to this act. My name is Sean Watson. I'm a university graduate from the University of Auckland, having completed a BA Honours in Politics and International Relations, where some of my studies centred around ethics and health policy. My father is an Auckland City Councillor, and both my sisters have been involved in local politics through the local boards, so I have been born and raised in a very politically involved household, which has offered me a rare glimpse into the mechanics of politics at both the local and national level. My interest in politics today brings me to the deeply emotive topic of euthanasia, because right now we are able to vote in a referendum on whether to legally permit the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide here in New Zealand. At no other time in our lives have we had an opportunity such as this to alter a part of life that we will one day all experience: death. For just about as long as civilization has existed, despite pain and suffering, we have always viewed death as something outside of our control that eventually takes its course. This is despite our willpower and desire to resist it. With the legalization of assisted suicide, we will be taking death into our own human hands and divert the mission of medicine on a different trajectory than it has ever known, other than its purpose to preserve and protect life. In 1984, the Netherlands was the first country in the world to rule euthanasia and assisted suicide as acceptable. And 36 years later, New Zealand is now faced with the same life or death decision. A decision whether to give people with a terminal illness or a grievous and irremediable medical condition the option of requesting assisted dying, as stated in the End of Life Choice Act. As New Zealand law currently stands, there is an inviolability to human life. It may neither be thrown or taken away, and the law upholds this inviolability, protection from violation, for the good of all. However, the End of Life Choice Act amends the current laws by removing certain protections for particular categories of people. Currently in New Zealand, there is a bright line that marks off when a life may be taken, and that is never. If the End of Life Choice Act is to pass through this referendum and start to operate as law, the bright line that currently exists will become blurred for those that are eligible under the Act for Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide. Once the law has changed from a blanket prohibition against intentional implementation of death to a law that allows it for a particular group of people under certain circumstances, there will be no going back, and there will be no logical place to draw the final line. It is firstly paramount that we take this into consideration when placing our vote in these coming days. Firstly, one of the main overarching arguments for the legalization of assisted suicide is individual human autonomy and self-determination. However, what the self-autonomy argument does not consider is the concept of community. We as human beings occupy interconnected communities where one self-autonomous decision can indirectly or directly affect the autonomy of another. A more simple way of looking at this is that expanding one freedom can often limit another. It does more than simply provide options. Expanding personal freedom to include assisted suicide undermines another right, to remain alive without having to justify one's own existence. A particular community of people with the ripple effect of one self-autonomous right to euthanasia and assisted suicide could have a negative impact is those with disabilities. There is an intersection of attitude towards people with disabilities and euthanasia, because associated between the two are words like suffering, pain, and loss of control. And these same words of suffering, pain, and loss of control are talked about in relation to people with terminal illnesses. Several long-term conditions that cause disability are also terminal illnesses, and people living with a disability caused by multiple sclerosis and motor neuron disease, for example, will meet the criteria in this act, as these chronic conditions are incurable. A potential lack of distinction between terminal illnesses and disabilities in both society's view and acts like David Seymour's is a cause for great concern. Disability and terminal illnesses are two different things. However, through frequent incorrect conflations between the two, societies could now and in the future endorse the legalization of assisted suicide for people with such characteristics. For disabled people who go through pain, perceive suffering, and have a huge reliance on assistance but live a fulfilling life to the best of their abilities, this could be like placing a measurement on their right to existence. The decision made by one person who endures suffering and wants to die affects the quality of life of another person who endures the same suffering but wants to live. Subsequently, people who are eligible for assisted suicide under the Act could begin to feel they would now have to justify themselves to others as to why they are putting the public health system to the expense of keeping them alive, and why they are putting their families and caregivers through the burden of caring for them. There are many vulnerable people in our society who could feel the pressure to end their lives, and with that, New Zealand outlawed the death penalty on the very basis that one wrongful death would be too many. And this was despite the death penalty having many safeguards built into it, like jury trials and several rounds of judicial appeal. No law or policy is perfect, and all have unintended consequences which can be detrimental to certain members of society. Blurring the line through the implementation of the End of Life Choice Act will be a dangerously murky path to navigate. We as a collective must seek to prioritize the greater good for this generation and the generations to come by acknowledging the untapped risks that the Act will bring with it. In addition, a concept that I would like to bring to the forefront of this discussion is that of the slippery slope. The slippery slope is a legal concept that surmises that one exception of the law is then followed by a range of other exceptions. Eventually, the particular law spirals down to a state that is unrecognizable to what it once was. But more than that, it slopes down to something that was once considered unacceptable before the law was passed. In almost every state that has chosen to legalize assisted suicide, the slippery slope phenomenon has come into play. In the Netherlands, the law lays down that a person must be suffering hopelessly and unbearably. In Belgium, the law states that a person must be in a hopeless medical situation and be constantly suffering both psychologically and physically. However, come 2006, the Royal Dutch Medical Association declared that being tired and over the age of 70 is an acceptable reason for the permitting of assisted suicide. A 3-year inquiry commissioned by the Royal Dutch Medical Association concluded that doctors can help patients who ask for help to die, even though they may not be ill, but suffering through living. Research has also shown that 30% of doctors in the Netherlands have had patients request assisted suicide even though they do not have a serious physical condition. And until 2010, the practice of psychiatric assisted suicide was rare despite being permitted in the mid-1990s. However, even with most Dutch psychiatrists, doctors, and the general public being opposed to psychiatric euthanasia, 2017 saw 83 cases where patients were euthanized. One such example highlighted is an otherwise healthy Dutch woman being euthanized 12 months after her husband's death for what was termed as prolonged grief disorder. Slowly but surely, a slope has slipped in the Netherlands. If the relaxation for the applicability of assisted suicide is slowly changing over time in countries that have already accepted the practice, what would this mean for countries that suffer from some of the largest suicide rates in the world, like New Zealand? A fundamental concern of the legalization of euthanasia is the social messaging that it sends to society at large, and the facilitation of the culture of death. The meaning of life has the potential to become completely altered and redefined. Old age becomes viewed as a curse as opposed to a blessing. Death is seen as the easy way out to life's woes and hardships. A particular statistic that I wish to highlight in regards to the social messaging of euthanasia is that in 2007, the same year that euthanasia laws were further liberalized in the Netherlands and open to different categories of suffering, the suicide rate increased by 35%. The major concern alluded to earlier in the New Zealand context is the death culture that is created and the loss of hope amid suffering. For a country which has a serious problem with youth suicide, the precedent set in countries which have legally permitted euthanasia is of legitimate concern. Yes, David Seymour's End of Life Choice Act doesn't currently allow for psychiatric euthanasia, but whether we like it or not, how society collectively views the value and sacredness of life will change over time, and weak bills will always buckle under the pressure of those who seek to expand the scope of its practice. It is fitting that the last section of this discussion focuses on palliative care as a hopeful step forward, but that can't be done without highlighting the effect the slippery slope phenomenon has had on palliative care. In nations like the Netherlands, euthanasia and assisted suicide was legalized to be a last resort when there was no other treatment that could work. However, palliative care consultations are in fact not mandatory in the jurisdictions that allow its practice. This is despite uncontrolled pain and symptoms being reasons for people seeking euthanasia. In Belgium, for example, requests were made by the Belgian palliative care community for an obligatory palliative care consultation. Despite these requests, their attempts were denied. Palliative care involvement, according to statistics, has declined in terminally ill patients who consider euthanasia as an option. Palliative care teams were only consulted 19% of the time in euthanasia cases. However, by 2007, this palliative care consultation had decreased to just 9%. With the slippery slope phenomenon at play in other jurisdictions, we in New Zealand could see less funding, less development, and less staff allocated to palliative care for patients over time. Physicians in the field of medicine have for thousands of years had one job and one job only, and that has been to look after and preserve the life of their patients. The legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide alters the purpose of medicine, which could diminish the influence of palliative care on the medical profession here in New Zealand. It has been reported that one of the main considerations for why people with illness, disabilities, and of old age consider assisted suicide is a fear of being a financial burden on their family. A survey conducted in Oregon showcased that 66% of people requested assisted suicide based on the fact that they feared being a burden financially. This showcased that the reason for people's requests were not irremediable suffering, pain, or inability to find treatment. Since when did life become so cheap? Unfortunately, we live in a world today that continues to place an unfounded value on money. In the process of our reliance on it, multinational corporations do and will continue to exert power over the fragile networks that are our political systems. With the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide, restricted healthcare funding allocations, shortages of beds, and an increasing elderly population may allow policymakers to look at euthanasia as an effective cost-cutting mechanism. Compare the cost of healthcare that can stack up to thousands of dollars and euthanasia which is as cheap as $35. The legal permitting of euthanasia and assisted suicide will open up another door that policymakers with financial agendas can exploit. We may not necessarily see these actions in our lifetimes, but the normalization of such approaches and changing of attitudes will likely present themselves in the future. Human society is riddled with the changing of attitudes and beliefs over periods of time that may have once been considered unacceptable, and that is indeed what the slippery slope phenomenon is. The cost of a lethal injection is $35, a figure that inheritance-minded family members and pressure-ridden medical staff could bear in mind. And even so, when patients request euthanasia and receive their consultations, there is no definite way for the physician to be able to tell if they are in fact being pressured by financially motivated family members. We need to instead be investing our time, energy, and resources into research in the medical field that will enhance medicine and our ability to cure terminally ill patients. The pain and suffering that a terminally ill patient goes through must not be overlooked or discounted. However, instead of telling people that they are courageous for ending their life in the face of affliction, we as a collective society need to encourage virtue in affliction as well as courage in hardship. The only way forward is to develop our palliative care and medicines. This has indeed from the very beginning been the purpose of medicine. Let's not blur that bright line that currently exists in New Zealand and instead work towards a society with a long-term vision that considers the greater good. Quite frankly, this act lacks adequate safeguards. There is no stand-down period between the request and administration of the lethal drug. The only day between the request and death is the 48 hours required to check the paperwork. In other jurisdictions such as Oregon, the cooling off period is 15 days, 9 days in the Australian state of Victoria, and 10 days in Canada. With terminally ill patients more likely to be struggling with depression and mental health issues, this 48-hour period does not take into consideration the roller coaster of emotions that patients go through, whether they are demoralized one day or positive the next. As the founder of the hospice movement, Dame Cicely Saunders once said, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. Death is the last enemy, and as long as we have a breath, there is purpose and meaning."